What's up, guys? This is Mike Geigerich. I'm the Director of Communications for End Overdose. Super excited to welcome you to the End Overdose podcast. This is a platform for conversations with people driving real-world change, whether that's in the arts, sciences, or public health. Today, we're joined by translational neuroscientist Brooke Sanders. Brooke received her Master's of Biomedical Research at Wake Forest, founded End Overdose's first North Carolina chapter, and has been studying the effects of cannabis use for 6 years. Alongside all that, she's the Director of Chapter Relations at Students for Sensible Drug Policy and is End Overdose's Neuroscience Advisor. Really happy to have Brooke on the show for a wide-ranging conversation, covering everything from her findings and her research to her perspective on the overdose prevention and response landscape. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the conversation, and we'll see you next time. Brooke, welcome to the End Overdose podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. You know I love you guys. I'm so happy to be here. I am so excited to chat and get to talk a little bit about the work that I've done.
Yeah, we really appreciate all your support. You're the best. As our neuroscience advisor, you've really been killing it. So yeah, I would love if you could just maybe start by telling us a bit about yourself, your personal journey into the sciences, and what led to your interest and subsequent pivoting into the profession of neuroscience.
Definitely. So my name is Brooke Sanders. If you know me from social media, you may know me by just Shocky Sanders, but I'm a neuroscientist. I'm a PhD student focusing in neuroscience. I hold a couple positions right now, one of which being neuroscientific advisor with End Overdose. And I've had a long journey as a scientist and then more recently into scientific policy with drugs in the brain. And this started, I would say, probably at 3 years old. I knew I was a scientist. My dad was a chemist and he works in concrete, so not my exact interest of chemistry and science, but a scientist nonetheless. And I was always around science. I always knew that I was going to be a scientist. So when I went to high school and I went to a magnet sort of program high school that was based around medicine, the choice was easy. I mean, I knew that I was going to be in the sciences, but my love for neuroscience came a bit later in 2019 when I started my freshman year at Syracuse University. And they had an incredible neuroscience program, and I've always been interested in the brain and drugs in the brain. And it just really just kept going up from there. I've been in research for going on, I think, almost 7 years now, which is crazy because it doesn't feel like I could have been doing this work for 7 years, but I have. And ever since then, I've just truly dedicated my life to it. It's everything that I love in work and outside of work. I just love neuroscience. I love talking about drugs and educating people about drugs.
Absolutely. And I'm curious what specifically about drug interactions in the brain that interest you most from a neuroscience perspective.
I just love understanding how everybody's brain is so different and how it's influenced by so much that we can't see in the lab. When I'm studying human neuroblastoma cells that were donated to my laboratory, they tell me a story epigenetically, biochemically, but I don't actually get to see the consciousness and the personal experience side of things. So one day, hopefully, I really wish that we can merge more of these fields of psychology and neuroscience, but in a way that's so individualized. I think maybe that's something that's super interesting to me, is more of the wacky stuff of how do I tailor this drug to this one specific person so it's the best therapeutic for them.
Right, absolutely. And what has your experience been from Syracuse to Wake Forest? Your academic experience from all the way up to achieving your master's?
The journey was a little bit unconventional, probably in the grand scheme of things, because I was a COVID college kid. So I was lucky enough to start my research project and join a research lab 3 months into my first year of college, which was before COVID. So I had some good established work. I had a lab, a project that I was doing. COVID hit, I was working with patients. You can't do that during COVID in New York, definitely not. So I got sent home. That kind of put a little bit of a delay on some of the work that I was doing, but I was able to continue more clinical projects after that at Syracuse. I then graduated from Syracuse early, which is also kind of thanks to COVID because I got to take all of my, gen ed classes online pretty easily. and then started my master's in biomedical research with the focus in neuroscience at Wake Forest School of Medicine, which I just graduated from that program last year. So that journey has been a long journey. It's felt like it's been a couple of months, but that's been my life since 2019 with my research path just immediately starting when I got to college.
Yeah, and what are maybe some lessons that you took away from your studies?
So much. I would say I learned so many personal lessons throughout this. You go into science and you go into research, especially being very wide-eyed and excited of, I want to ask all these questions. Why wouldn't I get money from the institution, from the government to ask these important questions? And you kind of quickly realize there's so much that goes on behind the scenes of what you're actually allowed to research. And you can either let that really break you, emotionally and kind of get jaded to research, or you can learn how to work the system a little bit more and be able to do your research in ways that will get you money, but having to kind of bend to some of those higher powers to be able to get the money to do the work that you want to do. That's a huge lesson I had to learn. And then personally as well, I've recently also worked with a lot of patients. And I think learning as a scientist too, that like you need to have a brain that operates outside of your lab working by yourself. If you want to do research that's able to be translated to public health outcomes, you have to be able to work with patients, but also balance that of understanding that you're working with people, but also you are getting data from them. It's kind of like an ethical thing that you can go back and forth with, but there's so many practices in place where you're very respectful, obviously, of patients and their data and their safety and everything like that. So learning to balance that as somebody that comes from like a very chemical background and like biochemical background was definitely a lot.
Yeah, Theo, I feel like maybe we could jump in now onto specifically like the synthetic
Yeah, I mean,
cannabinoid.
Brooke, you've done so many things, and like some of the things that I was really curious on is just kind of the epigenetic impacts of your work with synthetic cannabinoids and really how they, work with the human genome. Can you explain some of the progress that you've made through your research on that?
Definitely. It's super interesting. It's my like special interest topic forever, which is an insane special interest topic to have because nobody thinks about it day to day. The protein that I dedicated 2 years of my life on doing my master's thesis, nobody would know. A fellow scientist wouldn't know it because it's so specific. And it's a protein that's found in the endocannabinoid system in humans and in other animals as well, but I was focusing on human neuroblastoma cells. So those are human brain cells, essentially. And it's this protein called cannabinoid receptor interacting protein 1A, or CRIP1A is the acronym. Nobody has studied this protein, but when other scientists do full genome searches for certain diseases or disorders, this one always pops up as having influence in the genetic profile of these disorders: schizophrenia, colon cancer, anorexia nervosa, but nobody was looking into it specifically. So I was very interested in this protein because I was interested in schizophrenia in particular, and then just ended up also studying cancer randomly as a neuroscientist. Sometimes you do that because the brain is so connected to everything else. But this protein in the endocannabinoid system, I was able to find that it has these effects on the CB1 receptor in humans. And the CB1 receptor is that primary receptor that's activated when it has exposure to cannabinoid. So that can either be an endogenous cannabinoid because your body produces cannabinoids naturally. It's part of your pain and memory system, but also with phytocannabinoids. So those are cannabinoids that you can ingest through using products like cannabis products. When you have cannabis exposure, cannabinoid exposure to that CB1 receptor, it changes the expression of that CRIP1A protein, which then goes back and to compensate for this cannabinoid, typically a synthetic one, that's coming out of nowhere into the cell's system. It starts rewriting the gene to compensate for this effect. And sometimes when you're rewriting that gene, you have mutations. And so I was looking at methylation, which is a type of mutation found in genes that this protein is responding to compensate for exposure to cannabinoids, but then downstream effects, sometimes just fully throwing off other systems completely. So this was the balance that we were trying to understand, is how much of a role does this protein actually play in response to exposure to cannabinoid? And what happens if we stop it? And what happens if we give the cell a ton of this protein? how does this make sense for what we know in the genetic profiling about other disease states like schizophrenia, like colon cancer?
So were you able to see like what would happen in a person as a result of that or that manipulation? Like how might that demonstrate in people?
The translatability of this epigenetic research is something that a lot of scientists do struggle with, because I'm working in such a controlled setting with a cell that I get to do exactly what I want to do in the cell. All I can infer from that data is how it also shows when we have genetic testing for these diseases in living, breathing people. So you can kind of make some inferences of, okay, well, look what we saw in this controlled setting. It does mirror this disease state, but that's as far as you can go. And I will say that this research that I was doing was purely pretty much exploratory, which means the scientist is looking at something that has like no publications, no data on it, just to give other scientists more data to work off of to do those clinical studies. So it was more foundational work. It wasn't looking to answer anything. It was looking to even just pose a question.
Yeah, I gotta ask, do you think that the rescheduling of cannabis is gonna allow you to do a lot more research, or has that impacted anything for you?
Yes. So I've worked with cannabis and cannabinoids for my whole entire research career. And there is this term in drug policy that we use called research harms, scientific and medical research harms. And that talks about how drug scheduling, when it's super prohibitive, like having things like cannabis in a Schedule I status, it slows down scientific research. What I had to go through working in Schedule I laboratories just to use synthetic cannabinoids that were at such a low concentration dissolved in ethanol, which I had pretty much, or anyone had no way of using these illicitly. This is because of scheduling. So the rescheduling is going to make it so much easier for scientists to get that work done, to discover more novel therapeutic targets, novel medications, and actually understand this drug at a way greater level now, because the process of getting that Schedule I license takes years and so much money from the institution and from the researcher. It's just makes it really difficult. So rescheduling, I think, is a great step for the advancement of research with cannabinoids.
What is the scheduling? What's the difference between a Schedule I, II, and III? And like you mentioned a little bit about cost, but how does that play into it? Just for people that may not know.
In the United States, we have this thing called the Controlled Substances Act, or the CSA. And the CSA is broken down into schedules, and these are categories from 1 to, I think we are just at 5 right now, Schedule 1 through 5. Schedule 1 being the most prohibitory status that a drug could be in, and 5 being the lowest. So any drug that is illegal in the United States is going to be in one of these categories. And Schedule I status means that a drug holds no medical uses, it has a high addiction potential, and it's a public health risk. And everything we know about cannabis says differently. So it was very nonsensical to keep cannabis in Schedule I status when we have FDA-approved drugs and medical markets for cannabis in the first place. So moving it to a Schedule III, I think, is great, because that's like the same schedule as codeine. That's a type of drug where, yeah, we understand it has some dependence liability, is what we call it. You could become dependent on this drug, on this medication, but it's given to you by a pharmacist. You can have counseling from the pharmacist. It's prescribed by a doctor. And integrating that federally will just help researchers be able to get a license a lot quicker to research the drug, because a Schedule III license does not cost as much money. You don't need a DEA compliant safe and security cameras. You don't need to be drug testing your new employees. Like, all of that time and money that goes into a Schedule I license can really slow things down. So that's just a quick overview of like the Controlled Substances Act and that scheduling tier.
Yeah, that sounds like great news. It sounds like we're going to learn a lot more. But yeah, you've researched a lot, like neuropsychiatric and sociological impacts of cannabis specifically. I think something that might be interesting is, what's one aspect of that research that you think people might find interesting?
My favorite finding of that work that I was doing, I was working with adolescents who were lifetime cannabis users. So these were people that had reported using cannabis for probably over 5 years. They were adolescents under the age of 18. I don't think that people really consider what cannabis harm reduction could look like. And that's what I was looking to set up this model of how can we establish ways in which we can reduce the outcomes of adolescents having harmful psychological effects, social effects from using cannabis. So I was looking at not just who's using cannabis, but who do they use cannabis with? So this is the social context that somebody is using a drug. They can either use the drug alone or they can use it in the presence of other people also using the drug. Those are two examples. And what I saw with my research is that adolescents who start using cannabis alone and they continue to use cannabis alone, they have horrible outcomes psychologically, socially, and have a higher risk for cannabis use disorder. Because what happens when you use a drug by yourself? You have no frame of reference of how much you're using. Is that normal compared to the general population? Am I using a normal amount of cannabis? I don't know. Nobody's around. You use more frequently, typically, when you're using alone at a young age, because again, you can't compare the amount of use to your peers. And so people actually who use cannabis socially, it's a protective measure when you're learning how to use a drug, because I always say, if you were going to use a drug like cannabis, you kind of have to be good at using it, and you learn to be good at things by socializing and doing things with other people. So mainly, I realized that a great cannabis harm reduction measure is to let people use cannabis and lift a lot of these barriers and laws, because they're going to use it anyways, and using it with other people makes them use less. It decreases their level of interpersonal sensitivity. So this means when they're using with other people, they're not having those breakthrough depressive and anxiety episodes at a young age. They have better social and internal confidence in themselves in every aspect of their life, because they're not isolating and using a drug by themselves. That's just not inherently healthy. So you can see here that cannabis harm reduction looks like an anti-prohibitionist model where people are actually able to socialize and talk about using this drug and use the drug with other people in places where it's legal or where it's medical. And I think that's super important, especially for young people.
It's actually really interesting. So it's almost counterintuitive. It's actually people will use less if they're using together as opposed, and it's overall safer. The isolation is a huge problem aspect, which I think, yeah, that is surprising. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think an example of that like resonates more with people is if I'm in my group of 5 friends and every time I'm going out with my 5 friends, they're having 2 drinks, I'm having 10, people are going to look at me sideways and they're going to say, you're drinking a lot of alcohol. You're using a lot of this drug. It's the same thing with cannabis. And so you adjust. Like if your friends are giving you a hard time for drinking too much, you're going to probably adjust, drink less, because that's the social norm that's created in the group. Same thing with cannabis. If you're showing up somewhere where people are smoking cannabis and you're using it all and nobody else can get any, that's socially going to be a problem. And that's going to bring you to their level, which is typically using less cannabis and using less frequently.
That's so interesting. And I guess pivoting a bit, you recently became the director of chapter relations at Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I would love to hear about the work you're doing, especially as we're talking quite a bit about cannabis, what you're seeing on the legislative front, both opportunities, challenges, and kind of where your work is taking you from that perspective.
So I was just at the United Nations in Vienna 2 months ago at the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs. So this is a conference that happens yearly with the United Nations where they're pretty much talking about drugs and crime. It's the Office of Drugs and Crime. And this is where they internationally schedule new substances every year. And again, scheduling is making it illegal, but putting it in that tiered category. They're based on how dangerous the drug is. It's a flawed system, but they use it still internationally. So one thing I've seen the last 2 years, especially on the cannabis side and the policy side, is slowly we have this insidious extermination, is literally how I would put it, of cannabis research science, because we keep continuing to schedule cannabinoids that nobody is using recreationally. But then you put a schedule on it, you can't research it. We don't have the opportunity to find out if it has medical uses. It just immediately goes in the category that says, well, no medical uses, when we haven't been given the opportunity to research it. So for example, with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, this year I delivered a statement, which, side story, was actually blocked by the United Nations. They did not let me give this statement to the board, even though they had previously approved me. That's a whole separate story. But I was giving a statement regarding opposing the scheduling of a cannabinoid called MDMA-bufobenica, which is used in research for angiogenesis-related disorders such as cancer and Alzheimer's disease. And if you make that drug illegal, all of that stops. All of that potential therapeutic target and understanding of the endocannabinoid system for cancer research is going to stop. But people are still going to get cancer. People are still going to need a treatment. And you're removing an avenue of scientific advancement by making this drug illegal. So that's the kind of work that I do with SSDP, is advocate for the understanding that you are in a very like trickle down way by scheduling this drug. You're not stopping crime. You're stopping scientists with great intentions of looking at this substance. You're pretty much causing worse patient outcomes because we're removing even a potential for this drug to be studied as a therapeutic. And then you're increasing this global prevalence rate of the disorder, of the disease, because we're not getting any closer to finding a therapy or a cure. So that's something I'm very passionate about. That goes into scientific research harms, but also how society suffers from this prohibition. And it's not patient focused. It's not crime focused even. It's just senseless, in my opinion. And that's what we advocate against, is not this policy that's just not sensible, but instead having policy that considers all these things. It considers the scientists and the patients before just slapping a label on it and saying, nope, it's illegal now because we don't want to deal with it being the next fentanyl. That's unfortunately what a lot of people use, is it's scheduling things before we even know how bad it could get because we're afraid of the next fentanyl, which I appreciate the precaution of not wanting to repeat something like that, of how our fentanyl crisis has occurred. But we don't need to be applying that model to things like synthetic cannabinoids that are nowhere nearly as deadly as something like fentanyl.
Yeah, and I'm curious if you know off the top of your head what schedule other drugs like ketamine and MDMA are, because obviously right now you're seeing a lot of ketamine therapy for treatment-resistant depression is one thing that's starting to become more prevalent. I know there have been discussions about the therapeutic nature of dosing MDMA in psychiatric settings. So I'm curious like what you're seeing in those regards as well.
Totally. On Friday, I just did an amazing session of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I've been doing it for about a year for OCD. It's not officially approved for OCD, but I personally think it's very helpful. I'm a personal believer in that medication. I think it's amazing, super safe, great in a clinical setting, and has great outcomes. But still, these drugs, you mentioned MDMA, that's Schedule 1. And we have evidence and we have science that shows that it does have therapeutic potential, and it's not as reinforcing as some other drugs that we know of, but they're stuck in Schedule 1. That's the thing. It's not actually if the scheduling is accurate, it's that they were placed in these categories a long time ago, like 80s and 90s, and nobody wants to step up to change it because that's a lot of work. And do you want to be the person that stands up there and says, no, I think that this drug should be legal and medical? There's not a lot of science in policy, not a lot of scientists talking to policymakers, so not many people are willing to stand up and do something about that. But yeah, we still have a lot of drugs that literally, ketamine is a scheduled drug. That's fine. We have a medicalized model for it, so it works. But things like the MDMA being in Schedule 1, that's just putting still huge barriers on us being able to use it as medicine in the same way we do as ketamine.
And kind of pivoting from SSDP, you also founded End Overdose's Wake Forest chapter, which was obviously a really exciting moment for our chapter program. I would love to pivot a bit and just hear like what inspired you to get involved with End Overdose and what that experience has been like, kind of spreading the organization's mission and resources.
Well, first of all, you guys just have great messaging and marketing. I mean, it's captivating. You see like one End Overdose video and you know it's that video, you know it's from your organization. And so after just seeing so much really cool, informative content from you guys where you're centering young alternative people, which I think is awesome because I am one of them, and having this really cool branding behind science and public education, like making it something that's cool that people want to get involved with. I knew that I needed to get involved with it. So I was able to start a chapter through Wake Forest School of Medicine. It was the first End Overdose chapter in North Carolina. It's still going to this day. It has new leadership since I've graduated, but that leadership is amazing. And I always have been really involved in drug culture and harm reduction. And I would make my TikTok videos all the time of being like, you guys should all carry naloxone. And even if you don't use drugs and people around you don't use drugs, you never know, because it's the truth. You could be walking down the street and there's somebody who's in need of medical assistance. In the same way, I can carry something like a tampon in my purse if, I'm not in need of it, because it could be for somebody else that needs it. It's just it's an item that you have. Like, that's how I view it. And so I really wanted to get involved, and your resources are just amazing through End Overdose. The education program is just amazing through like how it's taught of all of what I'm saying of why it's important to carry naloxone and why it doesn't need to be stigmatized, why it's something that could really help people and someone in need. So I just think that it's a great organization to bring to Wake Forest, especially when we had nothing like that at all. And there was a little bit of resistance, which maybe I could talk about. That resistance too is the best opportunity for change to help amplify that message, is when you're talking to people who don't agree with you. That's like when the best progress is made.
Yeah, like what type of challenges did you face when you were trying to start that chapter out?
Unfortunately, I still think that the general perception of things like naloxone and reagent testing kits, so like a fentanyl testing strip, people think that it implies the use of drugs or invites the use of drugs to their campus or community. The amount of conversations I've had with people where they say, I am not interested in this because if somebody has made that decision to use drugs, they have made the decision to accept whatever the outcome is. But people don't understand, obviously. Sometimes when you're in that situation, you have not made that conscious decision to ingest an opioid, which is how we see so many of those accidental overdoses that need naloxone because somebody didn't mean to take that drug. So I think the challenges were more just from a lot of people from like the extended student body, not the people in my program, and then some administrators just being really skeptical of thinking that this is going to invite drug use or send the message that we are encouraging drug use, which is just fully not the case. But I think those are like prime time to educate.
What are some of the lessons that you gained from, bringing naloxone on campus, bringing our training on campus? There's like is an entire result of your experience leading Wake Forest.
I think that it was just an amazing leadership opportunity and like opportunity for growth as well. I think End Overdose really encourages you to be a leader and get out there and like inspire fellow leaders who are competent in this education and training, which is something that I love. But also, it just created a culture of safety on campus, which I really appreciated. And it was able to inform so many of us of like, a lot of these colleges don't engage with the community around them. And something that we were really learning through engaging with End Overdose on campus is that this can be really helpful to our students, but then also to the community as well that surrounds our campus. And I think that was something that was great that we all definitely got out of it, on top of the fact that you feel safer kind of walking around every day, knowing that like, oh, I can spot in this crowd 10 people I've trained and they all have naloxone on them right now. That's awesome.
What do you think from your perspective, can organizations like us, you're an advisor for us, which we love our Brooke Sanders, but what can organizations like us and, different groups do to address the overdose prevention landscape, all the different problems that we start seeing around here?
I think that, and you guys do this very well, presenting the information in a neutral way, just as neutral as possible. This is the case. People use drugs. We're not telling people to use drugs or to not use drugs, but we're going to tell you how to respond. I think that that is so important, that neutral education. And another thing that's important too, especially in like these higher education programs like med school, unfortunately, all of our doctors, they get 3 hours of training on addiction medicine. The amount of third-year med students that I had met who had never heard of naloxone, and I know I'm very like isolated in my world of this is my whole life is drugs and drug policy, but some people just don't even have access to this education. They have a whole phone and an internet, and they still don't know what this stuff is. So I think these organizations like End Overdose are amazing because we need to be remembering ourselves that not everybody knows about why this is so important, and then really emphasizing that in these lessons, in these courses that we give people, is that this is actually, show them with data. This is more prevalent than you might think. You may not have any exposure to this, but that's a rare occurrence because this is a huge problem that's happening. This is a huge need, especially in some of these communities like where Wake Forest was at. And that was a huge sell to people as well. Showing people the opioid overdose death data from our county and how it outranked pretty much every other county in North Carolina, that was always like a big shock to people. So providing those numbers and just being factual and giving that education, I think is the best thing that we can do.
Yeah, I know a big part of your work, then your kind of mission is to make these topics accessible to the layperson, the everyday person, which whether that's maybe not just med students on campus, but also like the average citizen. How do you go about that process? so that this information is disseminated as widely and as understandable as possible?
Something I've had to learn as a scientist is that you speak a certain language. Everything that I've talked about today, I could say in terms and describing it in ways that just would not be beneficial for anybody to hear because it's not accessible. I understand that, like, I have higher education. I've dedicated my life to this. Sometimes you get in a position with scientists where they're so in their science mind that they don't think about talking about their science to other people. How I go about it is almost like a translator. I speak this scientific language, but I also want to speak the language of just everyday people because I'm around everyday people every day. I'm not around scientists all day yet until I start the PhD program. Going about that is just understanding that you can talk in a way, in a language with vocabulary that anybody could understand without losing facts. I feel like a lot of people think that you have to like dumb it down to be able to explain it to somebody, and then you miss a lot of that crucial information because you're trying to make it so somebody else can understand you. No, you don't need to do that. Speaking in a way and learning to speak in a way, this is a tool that I've just had to develop over time. Learning to speak factually, but not in an overly pretentious, high-level vocab, super niche scientific way. It's definitely like a skill, and I'm still working on it. But I think it's something that more scientists need to do because your science can't just be for scientists. That's how we get stuck in this weird loop of the public is not benefiting from anything at that point.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting you coming at this from the medical perspective. And with End Overdose, we'll be training at festivals. And how do you communicate in 3 minutes how to respond to an overdose in a way that a raver on their way to grab water, grab snacks, and then go like enjoy a music set? How do you make that possible? So I think your work and your kind of direction really just aligns so nicely with what we do.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And that also, because I've done so many events with End Overdose, like doing Breakaway and these big festivals, and it's loud and people are excited to get back to the stage. You really have to have that information so straightforward so you can keep that person's attention. I mean, I could do a whole 6-hour lecture about the intricacies of the pharmacology going into naloxone and the endogenous opioid system. The raver does not care about that right now. They can learn about that on their own time. You just got to let them know the signs, what to look for, and then how to properly use the medication.
Well, yeah, I would love to hear kind of, I guess, as a big picture question, what do you hope to see for overdose prevention and response, in the future? Both from, I guess, kind of like an end overdose perspective, but also your work with SSDP and your studies.
That's such a loaded one because there's so much. I do some interning at a syringe exchange program. So it's a 1-for-1 syringe exchange program. So I work directly with patients who are using drugs, who are injecting drugs. I have patients who purposefully buy and inject fentanyl. And like for overdose prevention, we need to be expanding our idea of who we see as people who use drugs and people who need education and support, because it's at all these different levels. But the problem is that I keep seeing with a lot of these harm reduction things is it's almost like we can't keep up. Are either of you familiar with like medetimidine?
Stronger xylazine. But for people that don't know, it's worth explaining. Do you want to give us a little synopsis and break it down?
Definitely. So we faced these issues where it was like fentanyl is being adulterated into the illicit drug supply. That's a problem. Then we had xylazine, and that was super fentanyl. And now we have medetimidine, which is super xylazine. It's going to keep going. And it's because you make one drug illegal and you try and take it out of the supply, doesn't mean people are going to stop using it. They're going to create or find something else. And so that's what we're seeing with medetimidine as well, where it's questionable if it's going to be responsive if you give somebody naloxone. I'm going to say no if they're using that drug just on its own, that I don't think that's going to be the case. So now we have these like naloxone resistant drugs when we started with fentanyl that aren't just going to respond because they're not traditional opioids. They're not even a synthetic opioid like fentanyl. So I think the biggest problem right now is that we're great on educating about fentanyl and fentanyl testing strips. Besides fentanyl testing strips, we have some xylazine testing strips, but the more drugs that come up, the more avenues we need to either test or reverse an overdose, and we just can't keep up. So I think the foundational education of where this started is so important, but with harm reduction, because our supply is changing so quickly, our education also needs to catch up to that too.
Do you mind just explaining a little bit about like chemically what met is? So how it's different than an opioid?
Definitely. So drugs like fentanyl are opioids and they work on your endogenous opioid system. And primarily what's happening during an overdose is that you have respiratory depression and you're losing like your ability to breathe. That's obviously, if you can't breathe, your body system is going to shut down, your brain is going to shut down, causes brain damage, hypoxia. You're having that oxygen loss. Your body can't clear carbon dioxide. Naloxone is going to reverse that, restore breathing, start that carbon dioxide clearance. With some of these other drugs like xylazine or medetimidine, they're not opioids. They do not bind to that opioid receptor that naloxone has the ability to kick out, because that's what it does. Naloxone goes into the system, it sees someone in its parking spot, and it kicks it out of the parking spot and parks there for up to 90 minutes and blocks the ability of anybody else to get that parking spot. Well, if we're not dealing with an opioid that fits in that parking spot, we're dealing with this huge, massive, 18-wheeler truck. There's no even opportunity for naloxone to come in and kick it off because it's parked in the truck's lot. It's completely somewhere else. With drugs like xylazine and medetimidine, naloxone's not going to work. It's not in the same system. These are veterinary medicines. Also, too, with the syringe exchange program that I work with, like, you're not even just seeing like horrible overdoses with these veterinary medicines, which we do see, but also like the wounds and the infection you can get from these. We've just escalated. We've gone from like 10 to like 10,000 with some of these new synthetic drugs just being put in the drug market. And it's just getting worse and worse, unfortunately. But yeah, overall, there's more drugs now that are naloxone resistant because they're just not opioids. The market is evolving in other ways to cut these drugs.
So if you're in overdose from one of these naloxone resistant medications, then how do you reverse the overdose?
It's tough because I don't see many cases of people using these drugs alone. Monosubstance use, that's what we call it. We don't see many people just using xylazine, intentionally using xylazine. So a lot of these overdoses are also associated with an opioid overdose because maybe somebody's taken a combination of heroin, fentanyl, xylazine. In that case, if the overdose is being primarily driven by the effects of the opioid, if you see the signs of an opioid overdose, you can use naloxone to restore that breathing, but that's not going to do anything about the respiratory effects that like xylazine can have or the consciousness effects that xylazine can have too during an overdose. So if you see the signs, I think it's always good to administer naloxone because opioids may be involved, but in isolation, if somebody is just overdosing on xylazine, that's tricky. That's a situation where you're calling 911 and like we just don't have like a thing on hand like we do with naloxone to be able to reverse that. So I think the main thing is just obviously getting that person to the hospital. They may have some level of like reversal agents, not like reversal agents in the hospital specific to the drug, but just agents more to restore breathing pretty quickly in a hospital setting that we just like don't have available. Like literally like adrenaline shots pretty much, but it's tricky.
As a paramedic, we just typically manage the respiratory drive. So essentially we just manage the airway. So like a lot of the times what can happen with met and xylazine is they create that synergistic effect or they create potentiation, which strengthens the drug. And you're right, there's no reversal agent for them. We have to, manage breathing with just like ventilation. So it can rescue breathe essentially until paramedics arrive.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And also when you look at those drugs pharmacologically and you understand how they actually are binding and what route they're going to decreased respiration, it's even more insidious because it's not a direct target like with opioids with the mu opioid receptor, where if you can manage that mu opioid receptor activation, you buy yourself some time. It doesn't look like that with these veterinary medicines. It's not that direct target, which like freaks me out a little bit because I would hope that maybe there's something out there that we could have like naloxone that could be able to reverse the overdose that people could just carry, but it's way more complicated. These drugs are just way more complicated than that.
Yeah. And are there any other trends, positive or negative, that you're seeing? Obviously, this is like an emergent drug and the drug supply is not a great development, but are there any other trends or like kind of upcoming things you're seeing?
Oh, yeah, a ton. The drug market is changing so fast. I have a lot of patients who intentionally and solely just inject things like fentanyl. We've always kind of thought of fentanyl as a thing that's like super, super deadly. And that is true. If you have no exposure or previous exposure to opioids, you have no tolerance, tiny amount can really cause you some problems. But in people who have built up tolerance, they can use fentanyl daily and inject fentanyl daily. I think another one of the big problems too is that we're seeing all these issues with, there's a lack of overall support for harm reduction in these programs. People think that like it's a bad thing to be giving out syringes. I would disagree. I've watched this syringe exchange single-handedly lower the prevalence of HIV and Hep C in our county, like over the past couple of years. These trends are like, we see something really good, we have naloxone, we have fentanyl testing strips, people are evolving as the drug market evolves. But then I feel like sometimes you can see just a little bit of these numbers get better. There's less overdoses, but there's still other problems like infectious diseases. And so sometimes the priorities shift, maybe funding wise or what the focus is on. So I think the trend right now is making sure we have to stay balanced because everything is always changing and we still need to be like supporting the harm reduction space, even if it completely shifts away from just needing naloxone.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, just kind of to wrap up, are there any projects you want to plug, anything you're working on? I know you're heading to receive your doctorate. Would love to hear about anything you have in the works.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, with SSDP, I am the co-host of our podcast that we're launching soon called Say No More, but no is KNOW. So we're more education based around just drugs and drug policy in general and like how young people can get into science and drug policy. So that will be launching soon. That's co-hosted by one of our board members at SSDP. His name is Jackson Rund. We just chatted up. We talk about our crazy experiences working in science and drug policy, and we're both in the cannabis world. And then personally, my social media is everywhere you can find me, just at Shocky Sanders. I'm doing a lot of educational content right now surrounding a drug called 7-hydroxymetragenine, or 7-OH, which is the active metabolite in kratom, and how I'm very concerned that if this drug is made illegal, we're going to get something else that's stronger and that's really going to adulterate the market. And so a big project I'm working on right now is pushing for age verification, safe manufacturing, product labeling guidelines, keep these products on the market, but make them safe and take everybody's IDs to have these products. That's a big thing I'm working on. I submitted a statement to Congress about this issue like a month ago. And then I'm always doing something. This is the problem. I'm always doing something. So I'm sure if you just keep up with me on social media, you will see what I'm up to next. I'm actually leaving in 48 hours to go do a religious pilgrimage in Portugal. So I'm doing that soon. Not science-y, but it's still cool. Use your
Portugal.
PTO, everyone.
Ooh, Portugal. Send pictures.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, I think those are all my questions, Brooke. I just really appreciate you joining the podcast. It's been such a great conversation with you and could talk for another whole hour just to get your expertise. So thanks for hopping on and joining us.
Of course. I appreciate the both of you and End Overdose. You guys are always killing it. I absolutely love it.
Likewise. Well, thanks for all you do for us. We appreciate you.
Of course.